Good afternoon, everyone. I made a note to myself to not actually speak after Jada Pinkett Smith. But I think we'll do fine. I think we'll stand up to it. So I have the great fortune of facilitating a panel discussion here this afternoon with three very distinguished representatives from three organizations who spend virtually all their time. They work every hour of every day of every year fighting human trafficking. And we thought it'd be a great opportunity for all of us to get together and hear what they're up to, but perhaps as importantly, hear how we at Sabre and how we in the travel industry can help actually ensure they're successful in their efforts. So first I'm going to do some introductions, and then we'll get right to some Q&A. So first joining us is Holly Burkhalter, who is Vice President of Government Relations for International Justice Mission. The International Justice Mission is a human rights agency that brings rescue to victims of slavery, sexual exploitation, and other forms of violent oppression. So Holly, thank you for joining us today. Next is Bill Bernstein, who is Deputy Director of the Mosaic Family Services Organization. Mosaic Family Services is a nonprofit, community-based organization that provides culturally and linguistically competent services to refugees and immigrants in crisis. So, Bill, thank you very much for joining us today. And then last but not least is Sarah Jakiel, who is the Deputy Director for the Polaris project, which you heard a little bit about just a few minutes ago. Polaris Project is committed to combating human trafficking and modern-day slavery and to strengthening the anti-trafficking movement through a comprehensive approach. So thank you guys, and thank you, Sarah, for joining us today. So we have a relatively short time this morning, and you guys know for me that can be a challenge. So we're going to jump right into things and go right to some questions and let you guys educate us on what it is that you're up to. So first, I'm actually going to start with you, Holly. So earlier in the show, the presentation earlier, there was a comment about President Obama, who earlier this week gave some significant remarks regarding the United States commitment to fighting human trafficking, and actually called out your organization in those comments. So I wanted to see if you could share with us how you feel that governments, non-governmental organizations, also known as NGOs, so government, non-government organizations, and the private sector, how we can work together to combat human trafficking.
I'm glad to respond. We were awfully pleased to be mentioned in the President's speech, and I was glad of the speech. But at the end of the day, I think the role that our government needs to play is, in addition to the speeches and the diplomacy, which are terribly important, I think when you have found solutions that work, I think that we need to see businesses and government work together and scale up and replicate those things that work. And we had an experience with this when the Gates Foundation gave my organization $5 million to see whether our efforts to work with law enforcement in the Philippines would actually, to rescue little girls from prostitution, whether it would actually succeed in lowering the rate of prevalence of kids available for sex overall. In other words, would law enforcement work the way we expect it to work? It'll dry up the crime? Well, it did. We did a baseline prevalence study, and we found after 3 years of working with the Philippines police, which was a rocky road, it did not start out great, it got lots better, and at the end of 3 years, we'd rescued, with the police, 300 underage girls from brothels, arrested about 80 perpetrators, created good aftercare standards, and we found that when we did another prevalence baseline study, that the availability of little girls for sex in the second largest city in the Philippines where we were working had been reduced by 79%. Now, it's just a snapshot and it's one place, and we haven't left, we're still there. But when you find that a law enforcement and victim support and aftercare and engaging with all parts of the justice system can actually drive that crime way, 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 way down, then you ought to replicate that model. We're doing so, but we're doing that with entirely private dollars. You know, we need to get the US government to get out there and say what worked, not just from IJM's models, but from others, and say, let's put that in other countries that are having the same problem. So what we would really like to see is the US government step up in a big way with a great deal more budget for fighting trafficking everywhere than we've seen to date.
Thank you. Thank you, Ollie. Next, I'd like to go to you, Bill. One of your organization's Mosaic, but you're part of what's called the Freedom Network, which is an organization, kind of a coalition of 27 NGOs who come together to focus on human trafficking. As such, you have a good national view on what's happening in the area. So maybe you can just share with us a little bit about what you're seeing as it relates to human trafficking from a national perspective.
Sure. Sure, thanks very much. And you know, to begin answering that, I also, again, want to thank Sabre for doing this, because it's really nice to be able to answer a question about a topic which is itself depressing, and to have to give examples that aren't real uplifting, to be able to follow something as uplifting as Sabre signing the code and as the contributions that are going to be made to the future lives of these people by Jada and with the partnership from Jada Pinkett Smith and all that we're going forward with. What we're seeing, I think, in this area and around the country is the fact that wherever people can take advantage of other people, it's happening. So a few years ago, a young woman from an Asian country jumped out of a second-story window of a house in the mid-cities area between Dallas and Fort Worth. Upper middle-class house, very nice neighborhood. She sprained her ankle. She had the contact information, though, for a pastor from a church that was frequented by members of her community. She contacted him. He, in turn, contacted law enforcement. When they investigated, they found out that the couple that lived in this home were, in fact, running commercial sex operation out of their house. None of the neighbors would have suspected. If I lived next door, I might not have suspected. And as you said, I talk about this every day. There was, and really that's what I'm going to give, some brief examples of cases that have been seen around the country, just so that everyone knows how hidden these things can be and what to be aware of in a way. There was a factory just north of here, outside Tulsa, Oklahoma, of a man who brought workers from India, welders, that were professional people doing welding in their own country. They came here expecting to be paid very high wages. They had to put up a lot of money, which was difficult for them to get. Once they were here, abysmal working conditions, long hours, they really weren't being paid, very minimal sum. They were being fed, again, not enough to support any of them. It was uncovered because the workers that came here from India were all different religions. So there were some Hindus, Muslims, and Christians. And there happened to be a Pentecostal church next to this factory, and the owner of the factory let some of the workers go to that church to worship. And they had somebody, a big guy dressed in black, watching them. One day he wandered off, and the pastor went to the back of the church and asked these guys, "So what's happening with you at the factory next door?" They told him their story. That's how this came to light. He started making calls, and it's a long story, which I'd be happy to tell if I had more time, because it's a pretty interesting story. But eventually it was uncovered, and the owner of the factory was tried and sentenced to pay restitution for these workers. There was a motel in South Dakota in a rural area. A nice motel. So this is, you know, we're talking travel issues, but no one would have suspected this was going on. One day the owner of the motel called immigration enforcement to say there were some people working for him that weren't here legally and that should be taken out of the country. The immigration agent then hung up the phone and started thinking, what's wrong with this picture? When has it ever happened that somebody that employed undocumented workers asked me to take away his workers? The more he investigated, it looked like they were doing normal work, being paid normal wages. But although they were depositing checks in their bank account, they wrote a check back to the owners of the motel the next day, giving back all their wages. They worked regular 8-hour shifts at the front desk clerk, in the restaurant, cleaning up in the hotel, the motel, but they were awake most of the night being lectured to by the owners of the motel. Some of the types of cases that we're seeing both here and around the country are cases of domestic servitude. We hear a lot of that. And Amy from the State Department, from the Trafficking in Persons Office, spoke about that a little earlier. And the State Department has actually produced brochures. The Trafficking in Persons Office produced brochures that were put in consulates around the world. So the people getting jobs in America got these brochures. Not too long ago, a woman in the Dallas area who was a domestic servant ran out of her house holding one of these brochures. and it was in her own language. She found the first person on the street, showed him the brochure. He couldn't read it, but there was a phone number on it. The phone number was the National Trafficking Hotline. He called the number. Eventually, she was referred to us, and we were able to provide services. So to sum it up, whatever you can imagine, whatever type of work is there might be people taking advantage of other people. So I think I'll hold my comments to that. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill.
Well done.
Okay, so, Sarah, I'm going to come to you next. We saw a little bit of this in the video. You've talked about it a bit before, too. Your organization, Polaris, has very specifically developed some curriculum for companies like Hyatt, Hilton, Wyndham, so within the travel industry. So can you talk a little bit about what you've done with those companies and sort of some of the areas you've identified that the travel and tourism industry can make a difference?
Sure, absolutely. Well, I think I would be remiss to not start off by thanking Jada Pinkett Smith for conferring her airline miles on us. Thank you so much. Another round of applause. It's really very appreciated. So we have been working increasingly with the travel and tourism industry over the last year to 18 months, and we've developed specific curriculum that can be used in a lot of different ways. There's stuff you can use for your executive staff. You can look at your frontline staff and really look at housekeeping, concierge, bellmen, folks that might be doing valet or working in the parking lot, and give them the tools that they need to recognize what might be happening in the context of those hotels. It's a sensitive topic, and it can be challenging to introduce that to your staff. So a lot of the ways that we've worked with these companies is to look at how you even talk about human trafficking. Where do you sort of put the information? What are the types of settings that really help to have people come together to learn about this issue? But I think the most imperative piece of all of that is that we're training them to recognize signs. And it doesn't mean that every case of trafficking is going to scream out at you. You're not necessarily going to see all of the factors that are at play. But if you have a feeling that something's wrong, if you have an inkling that something doesn't feel right based on just a few factors, you can call the hotline and work with our staff to determine what's happening.
Okay, thanks. Now, Sarah, I'm going to stay with you. One of the, and you touched on a little bit there, but one of the powerful tools that you guys have and promote is the hotline. So can you talk about that in a little bit more detail? Two aspects of it. One is, what's the process that happens when someone calls the hotline? Can you describe that a little bit? And then a second question, which is one that I posed to one of your colleagues at our TMU event, which for me, it appears that one of the barriers you might have with a hotline is people concerned that they're calling in a false positive, that they see something happening.
Right.
I had a personal situation where on an airplane, I saw what I thought was a parent and a child, and the parent was just awful to the child. But there's a fine line between being a bad parent and accusing somebody potentially of a situation like that. So can you talk about what happens when calls come in, but also what you do to ensure that these false positives, accusations don't take place? Because I think that would help people get more comfortable with making those calls no matter what.
Sure, absolutely. So just to start off, we get about 1,800 to 2,000 calls every month into the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and the number is in your Passport to Freedom book, so I encourage you to all take note of that number. It's important to me to be able to sort of dispel or quell any fears that might be there about calling the hotline. So when you call in, someone is going to be a live answer every single time, 99.7% of the time, and they're going to say, National Human Trafficking Resource Center, how can I help you? And you're going to begin to tell them what you think you might have seen. And the role that they can play is to be the trained call operator who understands the nuances of all different types of trafficking. They're going to ask you what you saw, what made you think that there might be something going on, what the environment looked like around the area. If you're talking about a specific person, they might be asking you for information about what they look like or who they were interacting with. But the key there is that for us, it's not an accusation that's happening in the context of the call. It's just the beginning of an opportunity. And we're using our trained staff to help you see what might be there and what action we can take. I think it's also important to note that if we determined that a case of trafficking was potentially present, we have a network across the United States of 2,700 different organizations and law enforcement who are specially trained on this issue. So if I were getting a call in Dallas, I'd be calling Bill. I remember the case that he was talking about of that domestic servant. Or if I needed a law enforcement response, we're calling someone who's trained to understand the issue. So this isn't someone that's going to come barreling into your, to your business and to pull someone out without having done their due diligence. So I think it is really important to recognize that just making that call doesn't bind you in any way. You can make the call anonymously. It can be completely confidential if that's something that you could prefer. But just calling in provides us with the information that we need to see how and where we can look deeper.
Thanks. Thanks,
Sure.
Sarah. Okay, Holly, I'm going to come back to you on this one. We spent a lot of time focusing kind of the United States aspect of this topic. Now, your organization has brought relief to 11,000 children, women, and men since 2005. That's an amazing number. So congratulations on that, but I know you want it to be even more. So can we talk a little bit about outside the United States and talk a little bit about what happens abroad, and again, what can we do in the travel industry to help address these issues abroad?
Thanks for the opportunity. I'm really grateful. We've been blessed to work on combating modern-day slavery, both in the area of sex trafficking and sexual exploitation of minors, but we also work in bonded labor slavery. We have 2 major offices in India, and we're replicating that work across northern India as well. Because believe me, if you are in a brick kiln or a rice mill and you can't leave, and you're making no wages or starvation wages, and your family member is being held hostage, and you never get an hour off, that is slavery. That is modern-day slavery. And IJM was really founded on the radical proposition that for people who are in slavery, most of them will probably not be able to escape under their own volition. Somebody needs to go get them out. And we work with local law enforcement. We never go in on our own. We cannot be a substitute for proper policing. But it is our role to walk alongside the local authorities, help them gather the data and the information. We do it through a variety of means, undercover investigations, our investigators and operatives posing as clients, looking for girls or forced adults in the sex industry. We also do investigations of bonded slavery to find adults that are being held in violation of the law. And then we bring that information to local authorities. We encourage them, we help them, we walk alongside them to bring those people out to freedom. In the United States, it's very different because we do have much broader and more capable and extensive law enforcement, and we have a justice system that works. It doesn't mean we don't have a problem. You know only too well from everything you've heard today. We have a significant problem. But at least when you go to the authorities, you have confidence that they're not actually complicit in the problem. And in many places in the developing world, even though there are laws on the books, the authorities are doing absolutely nothing. The victims do not look to the police for help because they're complicit in the abuse in the first place. That can be changed. That is not a source of complete hopelessness. We had terrible law enforcement in our own country that were corrupt and abusive, 100 years ago. A corrupt and abusive law enforcement or police force does not have to stay that way. It changed here, it can change elsewhere. And we see it changing in the countries where we're working. One of the interesting things I noticed in this conference, though, is there's a few things that we've learned overseas that I would really like to see brought home here in the United States. When I heard from some of our speakers today about the incredibly poor, we have fewer than 1,000 beds for trafficking victims in the United States, where one of the survivors here went to 5 psychotherapists before she found one who could help her. And I was thinking to myself, gosh, our clients in Cambodia are getting better care than this. They're getting trauma-focused care. I know they are because we help teach it. With every aftercare home we work with in India, Cambodia, and the Philippines, we're teaching social workers how to deal with trafficking victims, and it sounds like we better get to our social workers and our social work schools here in the U.S. to do the same. But I want to say one last thing about the transportation industry specifically that really excites me very much indeed. where we work in India in collaboration with the Indian authorities on both bonded slavery in labor, but also in sex trafficking. The Indian rail system, one of the largest companies in the world, and one of the greatest transportation systems in the world, is both a piece of the problem. You know, we have many, many, many cases where trafficking victims are just going back and forth on trains. We have a very beloved case of ours, if you just forgive me and give me 2 minutes to tell you about it, where we had a client that was rescued from a brothel in Calcutta, and she ran away from a aftercare home, which was imperfectly supervising her. It wasn't our home, but it was where she was living, and with her boyfriend, who immediately trafficked her to Mumbai. And our operatives working with local police in Mumbai found her again, a city of millions and millions of people with thousands of brothels. And it's a precious story. She got there by train, and we found her in a rickshaw. But what it made me think about as I was hearing what Sabre is doing, what Carlson Companies is doing, what Southwest Airlines and Delta and others who are taking the pledge, what I thought about was what if the Indian rail system, this gigantic enterprise that reaches into every corner of the country, what if the rail employees got the kind of training that Sabre employees got this morning, or had a code of conduct, or had, knew what signs to look at when a child is clearly being taken somewhere against their will, or a woman is weeping and is being beaten on her way somewhere. I mean, all of the signs that Sarah was talking about that are sometimes quite subtle. Well, maybe they aren't quite as subtle in some of the countries that are not as sophisticated as the United States, but they're there, and I'll just bet you that if leaders in our travel industry like Sabre were to propose a conference with their Indian counterparts or with the Indian railways, we will find people of goodwill everywhere who want to stand up with you and do something to fight it in their own country.
Now that idea was an example of some of the ideas that we talked about at the session that Sam and Jada referenced that we had over lunch today. And during that session, we talked about the cycle of human trafficking from source markets to distribution to demand markets and all the different ways that we in the travel industry could help disrupt that. What we decided to spend our time, though, at the session was to focus in on one part of human trafficking, the one part that's actually full of a lot of hope. And it's the story of Tekla. It's the story of Petra, who were in our session and were able to convey what it's like to be a survivor, but also to convey the challenges of transition from being captive back to freedom. So one of the last questions I want to ask is back to you, Bill, which is, can you share some of your insights? You've been 11, 12 years now, of that particular aspect of it, the survivors. So we talked a lot about the process, how they get into it, how we can get them out, but once they're out, can you talk a little bit about that and your thoughts on how we might be able to help in that area?
Sure, and really probably the survivors that spoke earlier are the better people qualified to speak about this because people are going through a lot of trauma at the time. Before I do that, I want to bring back to reality something that we talked about at the very beginning, or rather that Jada talked about, that offer again of the mileage to people that might need to travel somewhere, because we had a case this week, Monday, a woman who came to us that stayed at our shelter overnight and then wanted to go home. And so then we have to look at our situation. Do we have the funding? How can we send her home? Can we fly her home? Her home was a long way away. She finally decided to go somewhere else, and it didn't end up being an issue, but it's just a very specific example of what a difference something that simple can make. And people who are, we've seen many different, there's no such thing as a typical trafficking case. That's one thing that whenever anybody asks, the first thing we say is, there is really no such thing as a typical trafficking case. So for example, we worked with a woman who was a lawyer in her country. Once she was here, she was under somebody's control. She was coming to visit her husband's relatives. The couple came together. And they ended up being, I wouldn't give the details of the story, but they were working in a small nursing home, working with elderly people. And eventually, they were able to leave that situation circumstantially through her own efforts. Over a long period of time, they were able to get permission to remain in the country by applying for what's called a T visa, and she has now taken the bar exam. So it's just very gratifying when you see stories like that of survivors that are able to make those huge steps forward and achieve a new life for themselves. One of the first cases we worked with we worked with about 25 people of a case that was originally involved something like 270 people were doing garment work on a factory in an American territory. And again, once they were had finally gone through their whole rehabilitation process, they got lives for themselves, have their families here, are working in this area, and have a decent life for themselves today. And I think the steps that are being taken with this Sabre initiative are going to mean a great deal. This offering of people to be able to get a scholarship, to study, to participate, to become workers in the travel industry, to ultimately become travel agents if they're able to go through this whole training, is a great step in that direction of people being able to move into something where they are self-sufficient. The way we always try to look at that in every issue is we think in terms of empowerment, because we don't want to put ourselves in a situation above somebody else. We want to look at them as a human being just like we're a human being, so we're trying to empower that person to make a life for himself or herself so that they then feel that they are capable of making their own decisions, capable of leading their own lives. And one thing I will say for everyone that might be thinking about something that they feel uneasy about and they want to talk to somebody about, as Sarah said, give somebody a call, because there are people that will look into that. And if it's happening, people have to go through an awful lot to get to that point where they are able to have this self-sufficient life, where they're able to feel comfortable, where they're able to, in some cases, as we've seen today, even speak out about that. But when that happens, that's really a very moving feeling. It's really a very, something that's so wonderful for all of us to see, that it's worth it for each one of us here today to take a hard look at what's going on around us and see if we can make the effort to work in this field. We believe that for every case that's been uncovered, as is said on the earlier display, there's at least 100 cases that aren't being seen. So let's try to be aware of it. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Okay. We have just a couple minutes left, so I'm going to pose the same question to each of you, and you see our time down there. So just real quickly, you've got a room full of people that are obviously very passionate about this, or else they wouldn't be here. Behind this group of people, there's another 10,000 or so people who are very, very passionate as well about it. What would you tell us? What do you want us to do to help you in your efforts? So, Holly, what do you need us to do?
I think it would be fantastic if the U.S. government and its many agencies, and when booking their overseas travel for 1 million different conferences a year, just really only frequented expat, code signners. Like, let's just go large with this. What can we say, Carol?
We agree with that. We agree with that.
It's like, go big or go home. I'm serious.
Thank you. Bill, what would you tell us? What do you need us to go do?
Back to what I said previously, I think just more awareness on the part of everybody looking at this. I'm going to quote, people quoted the speech that President Obama gave earlier this week about human trafficking, which was a very comprehensive, well-intentioned speech, covered the gamut of everything relating to human trafficking, involving men and women, foreign-born and domestic, adults and minors, which is what we are seeing in human trafficking. After his speech, President Clinton said there are a lot of NGOs around the country doing this work with very minimal funding, and they could all use some help. So I'm not asking anybody here to do that, but just think like that. Sabre is making a huge step in that direction. It would be great to see a lot being made in that direction so that more services really could be provided to just work with a lot of the people that are establishing lives for themselves.
Thank you, Bill. Sarah?
Thanks. So Bill won't say it directly, but I will. We need money. We definitely need money. It's true. But there's 3 things that I would ask you to do. I would ask everybody in this room to tell at least one other person about what you sat through today. Tell them about the training. Tell them about the speakers that you heard. Explain that this is happening in America, in our communities. Explain to them that it's sex and labor, it's men and women, it's children, and it's not just people coming from other countries, but it's people that we know in our schools and in our communities, and really commit to spreading the message in that way. And the next thing I'd ask is that we really look at getting the human trafficking hotline out there to bus depots, to train stations, to airports, to car rental agencies, to truck stops, to rest stops, to places where people who are in these situations are being frequently moved, not always, because transportation is not required for something to be trafficking, but often they are on the move, and those are some access points where they might be able to see the number and might be able to get help.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you. Okay. Our time is up, so I just want to say on behalf of all the Sabre team, thank you for your organization's hard work, but also thank you for your personal commitments. You can tell listening to you that you each are personally and passionate about that, and that's very inspiring to me and I know to others. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you.